Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark Davis sat at a small cafe table, the rain tapping gently against the window. The streets of the small college town outside were slick, the gray sky hanging low like a heavy curtain. At 23, Mark felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. His father's debts, the overwhelming student loans, and the constant struggle to keep up with his law school work while working a part-time job seemed never-ending. He took a long sip of his coffee, the warmth of brief comfort against the cold reality of his life. His phone buzzed on the table, a message flashing across the screen. Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation. Please meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. It's important. Mark frowned, confused. Who was she? And how did she know about his situation? He felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension, but with nothing else to lose, he decided to go. That evening, Mark arrived at the bistro, a quaint, upscale place with warm lighting and soft jazz playing in the background. The contrast between the luxury of the restaurant and his own frayed jacket, worn from days of rain and stress, felt sharp. He made his way inside, scanning the room for Eleanor. He spotted her almost immediately. She was sitting at a corner table, a striking woman with silver hair, sharp features, and an air of undeniable power. Her tailored suit and calm, composed demeanor made her stand out in the otherwise cozy bistro. She didn't look up when Mark approached, but simply gestured for him to sit. Mr. Davis, she said, her voice cool but welcoming. Please sit. I'll get straight to the point. I know about your debts, and I believe I have a solution. Mark sat down slowly, his stomach tightening. How did she know about his financial struggles? Was this a setup? He opened his mouth to respond, but she continued before he could say anything. I know you're struggling. The debts left by your father are enormous, and you're barely making ends meet with your part-time job. I can help you, Eleanor said, looking directly at him with a calm, almost calculating gaze. I'm offering you a way out, a solution that will solve everything, but you'll have to accept my terms. Mark felt a wave of skepticism wash over him. Who was this woman to offer him help? And why did she sound so certain that he would take her offer? He hesitated, unsure whether to trust her. What are your terms? Mark asked, his voice hoarse. Eleanor placed her drink down on the table and met his eyes, her gaze steady and unwavering. Marry me, she said flatly. Mark blinked, momentarily stunned by the simplicity of her words. Excuse me, he asked, thinking he had misheard her. Marry me, Eleanor repeated. This is not about love, Mr. Davis. This is a business arrangement. I will pay off your debts, ensure your financial security, and in return, you'll marry me. It will be a contract marriage, nothing more. Mark stared at her, his mind racing. A contract marriage? He had heard of such arrangements before, but never had he imagined he would be the one offered one. Mark opened his mouth to refuse, but the words caught in his throat. His family's financial ruin was no secret, and the idea of finally escaping it seemed almost too good to be true. But was he really willing to marry a woman he had just met, especially for money? Yet, as he sat there, looking into her calm, confident eyes, he realized that he had little to lose. And what do you get out of it? He asked, still trying to make sense of the situation. Eleanor smiled faintly, her expression softening for the first time. What I get is security, someone to share my name, my legacy, someone who will help me preserve my family's estate, and in return, I will give you the chance to secure your future. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. It's simple. You'll have what you need, and I'll get what I need. There will be no love, no obligation beyond the terms of our agreement. Just a business deal. Mark swallowed hard. His pride told him to refuse, but his mounting debts, his struggles, he was cornered. With nowhere else to turn, he found himself nodding. I'll do it, he said quietly. Eleanor nodded, satisfaction crossing her features. Good. We'll get everything arranged. But don't take too long to reconsider, she said with a knowing look. The offer won't stand forever. Mark left the bistro that night, his mind spinning. What had he just agreed to? And what kind of future was he stepping into? His doubts about the arrangement swirled, but he knew one thing for certain. He was about to embark on a life that would change everything. As he walked through the rain to his apartment, Mark couldn't help but think about Eleanor's calm, collected demeanor. How was it possible that she seemed so sure of everything, while he was just barely holding on? He had agreed to marry a stranger for a contract, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. What if this marriage wasn't just about money? But now, Mark had no choice but to find out. The days passed quickly after Mark agreed to Eleanor's offer, and soon, he found himself standing in front of a grand courthouse, the rain still lingering in the air. His mind raced as he waited for the ceremony to begin. He had never imagined that his life would lead him to this point. A contract marriage to a stranger, a business arrangement disguised as a union. He still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that this would never feel real. Eleanor, however, was a force of nature, calm and composed as ever. She had already made the arrangements, everything in place for a quiet, no-fuss ceremony. As they entered the building together, Eleanor turned to him with a faint, almost indifferent smile. "Ready for your new life?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Mark nodded, though inside, he wasn't sure if he was ready for anything. He was barely holding it together. A few minutes later, they were standing before an officiant, exchanging vows that felt more like a business transaction than a wedding. Mark's stomach churned as he repeated the words, his mind elsewhere. The only thing that kept him grounded was the thought that this would, at least, give him a chance to pay off his debts and secure his future. As the ceremony ended and the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Mark couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. Was this really happening? He was married now, legally, anyway. He glanced over at Eleanor, who seemed unaffected by the moment. She was already moving ahead, arranging things with the lawyer, ensuring that the paperwork would be handled immediately. He followed her, trying to keep up, but his mind kept drifting back to their conversation days ago. Was it really just a business deal for her? Or was there more he wasn't seeing? Later that evening, Eleanor led him through her massive estate. The house was as grand as he had imagined. High ceilings, walls of windows letting in the last rays of the setting sun, and rooms furnished with expensive pieces that seemed to have little connection to each other. Mark felt out of place here, as if he were a visitor in a world that didn't belong to him. Eleanor's cold, calculating gaze only reinforced his discomfort. She showed him to his room, a guest suite that could have easily been mistaken for a master bedroom. It was luxurious, yet sterile. It felt more like a hotel room than a home. "This will be your room," Eleanor said, motioning to the space. "Make yourself comfortable. We'll discuss the terms of our arrangement tomorrow." Mark nodded, but he didn't feel comfortable at all. He sat on the edge of the bed, the soft, pristine sheets making him feel even more alien in this place. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He had done what he had to do. He had secured his future. But was that enough? The next morning, Eleanor insisted they have breakfast together, a routine that would be part of their new life. Mark had no idea what to expect from this new reality, but he was trying to keep an open mind. As they sat at the grand dining table, the silence between them was thick, uncomfortable. Eleanor was the first to speak. "Mark, I hope you understand the terms of our arrangement. There are expectations, and I don't intend to let this become anything beyond what we agreed upon. We will attend social events together, maintain the appearance of a perfect couple, but that is all. I trust you'll keep your part of the deal," she said, her voice calm and detached. Mark nodded, his throat dry. "I understand," he said, though part of him wasn't so sure. He wasn't just a pawn in this game, was he? The thought lingered in his mind. Could he really go through with this, living this life for an entire year, or even longer? As the days went by, Mark and Eleanor began their new routine. They attended charity events, mingled with high society, and spent their evenings in quiet, detached conversation. Mark kept his distance, uncertain of his place in Eleanor's life. She, on the other hand, was always businesslike, never showing any signs of affection. He couldn't help but wonder if she was capable of any real emotion. One evening, after a gala, they found themselves in the car together, the sound of the engine filling the silence between them. Mark glanced over at Eleanor, who was staring out the window, her face unreadable. "Eleanor," Mark said, breaking the silence. "Why did you offer me this deal?" What's really behind it? You could have chosen anyone else. Why me? She turned her head slightly, her eyes locking with his for a moment before she looked away again. It's simple, Mark. I need someone to help me maintain my legacy, someone who won't ask for more than what's required. You were in the right place at the right time. It's nothing personal. Mark felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Was it disappointment? Or something else? He looked out the window, lost in his thoughts. Was this really all he could expect from her? A business deal with no room for feelings? Or would something change over time? Later that night, Mark lay in bed, the stillness of the room pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Eleanor than met the eye. He had agreed to this, but he wasn't sure if he could keep pretending forever. Could he really stay in this arrangement without it affecting him? And what would happen if Eleanor started to feel something real? As the days turned into weeks, Mark found himself caught between two worlds. His own, full of debt and desperation, and Eleanor's, full of wealth and expectations. He was married to her, but they were still strangers, bound by a contract, nothing more. But deep down, he wondered if that was truly all this was. Or could he, too, start to change? Could he begin to see Eleanor not just as a business partner, but as something more? And what would it mean if that happened? Mark had no answers. All he could do was wait and see. The weeks went by in a blur of formal events and quiet nights. Mark was settling into his new life, or at least pretending to. He attended the charity galas, the board meetings, and the high society parties that Eleanor dragged him to, each one feeling more like an act than a reality. But as time passed, something began to shift. He wasn't sure if it was the routine of it all or the subtle, almost imperceptible changes in Eleanor herself, but the distance between them was slowly starting to close. She was still reserved, still businesslike, but Mark began to notice moments, small moments, where she let her guard down. One evening, after a particularly boring gala, they found themselves in the car together, heading back to the mansion in silence. Eleanor had taken off her heels and was rubbing her tired feet, her usual air of control slipping just a little. Mark glanced at her from the corner of his eye, unsure if he should say anything. He had spent so much time in this charade, in this world that wasn't his own, and now he was starting to feel something he couldn't quite name. The coldness between them was starting to thaw, but was it real? Or just another act? You're quiet tonight, Eleanor said, breaking the silence. Mark turned to her, startled by the suddenness of her voice. He had been lost in his thoughts, unsure of where to go from here, unsure of what this marriage meant anymore. I was just thinking, he said slowly. About everything. About us. I mean, this arrangement. Eleanor didn't look at him right away. She stared out of the window, her face illuminated by the city lights passing by. Mark could see the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the armrest. He didn't know what to say next. They had barely spoken about the reality of their situation. He knew she had never promised anything more than a business deal, but something in him was starting to wish for more. He didn't know if it was love, or if it was just the loneliness of being stuck in a marriage that wasn't truly his own. But he needed to know, did she feel anything? Finally, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was softer now, almost tired. Mark, I know this isn't easy for either of us, but this was the deal. We both agreed to it. She paused, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. I didn't expect this, she said quietly, her words almost lost in the hum of the car engine. But it is what it is. Mark was silent for a moment, processing her words. He had expected her to remain cold, to keep him at arm's length, but instead, she had let down her guard just enough for him to see a hint of vulnerability. It unsettled him. He had convinced himself that this was just business, that there was no room for feelings. But now, as he looked at her, he wasn't so sure. Could he really continue living in this arrangement, playing his part while holding on to the hope that something more could develop? Eleanor, Mark said after a long pause. What if this wasn't just a deal? What if we weren't just pretending? What if this could be real? She turned to him then, her eyes meeting his. There was a flicker of something in her expression, something Mark hadn't seen before. For a moment, he thought she might say something, but instead, she simply nodded. I don't know, Mark, she said softly, but I do know that I'm not used to this kind of arrangement. It wasn't what I imagined, and I'm not sure what to feel about it, but I'm willing to try. Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Mark wasn't sure what had just happened. Had she really said that? She, the woman who had been so determined to keep everything strictly business, had just admitted that she was willing to try something more. Something real. As they arrived at the mansion, Mark's thoughts were still racing. He had never expected to hear those words from her. Could it be possible? Could this marriage, this business arrangement, turn into something more than either of them had anticipated? Eleanor had given him a glimpse into her heart, just a crack in the armor she had so carefully built around herself. And now, he found himself questioning everything. That night, as Mark lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. Was Eleanor starting to feel the same way? Or was he just projecting his own desires onto her? He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since this whole arrangement began, he felt like there might be a chance for something more. Something real. The next day, Eleanor kept her usual distance, though Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. They spent the day as they always did, attending meetings, preparing for upcoming events. But there was an underlying tension now, an unspoken understanding that they were both in uncharted territory. Mark wasn't sure where this would lead, but he couldn't deny that he was beginning to hope that maybe, just maybe, this contract marriage could turn into something deeper, something worth fighting for. But as he watched Eleanor from across the room, her composed exterior firmly in place, Mark realized that they still had a long way to go. The journey ahead was uncertain, and both of them were still holding on to their secrets, their fears. But something had changed, and that, he knew, was the beginning of something new. Days turned into weeks, and the subtle changes between Mark and Eleanor began to feel like something real. The once stiff, business-only atmosphere started to feel more like two people learning to coexist, and even, in their own ways, starting to care for one another. Mark had been prepared to live this marriage as a business deal, but as the days passed, it became harder to ignore the moments that felt different. Eleanor had let her guard down more often, her sharp business demeanor giving way to something softer, more vulnerable. She would smile at him across the table during breakfast, her usual icy demeanor thawing in the comfort of their quiet mornings together. Mark couldn't help but notice how her eyes softened when she thought he wasn't looking. Was this what he had hoped for? Or was he just fooling himself, getting swept up in the facade of a contract that he had agreed to without fully understanding the consequences? One evening, they attended a high-profile gala. It was the kind of event that Mark had come to expect in their new life together. Crowded, elegant, filled with business magnates, politicians, and socialites. He followed Eleanor as they made their way through the sea of people, exchanging polite smiles and small talk. It was a world Mark had never imagined he would be a part of, and though he had grown used to it, he still felt like an outsider. Eleanor, however, was in her element, confidently navigating the room, her presence commanding attention. As they mingled with the guests, Mark noticed how she seemed to draw people in without saying much. Her quiet confidence was magnetic, and he couldn't help but admire her. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease crept in. The moment felt almost too perfect, too calculated. Eleanor was the picture of composure, but Mark had begun to wonder if this marriage was as much of a facade for her as it was for him. Later in the evening, they found themselves in a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the noise and the chaos of the crowd. Mark was about to say something when Eleanor spoke first, her voice unexpectedly soft. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if we weren't just playing these roles?" Eleanor asked, her gaze drifting out the window to the city lights below. Mark was taken aback by the question. He hadn't expected her to voice something that had been swirling in his own mind. "What do you mean?" Mark replied, his voice quiet, almost tentative. Eleanor turned to him, her expression unreadable. "This whole arrangement, it's never been real, not in the way that people fall in love. But sometimes, I wonder if it could be. If we weren't bound by these rules, these expectations, could we actually feel something more?" Her words hung in the air, and Mark's heart skipped a beat. Had she just confessed to something he had feared to acknowledge? That there was more to this than just business? Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. His thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions, fear, and hope all tangled together. Could this really be happening? Was Eleanor finally letting go of the walls she had built so carefully around herself? For a moment, there was silence between them. Mark could hear the distant hum of the music from the ballroom, but it felt miles away. He was lost in the quiet intensity of the moment. "Eleanor," Mark finally said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. What if this isn't just a business deal? What if we're starting to feel something real? Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, her fingers playing with the edge of her dress as if trying to find the right words. When she looked up again, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that Mark had never seen before. I don't know, Mark, she whispered. But I do know this. I didn't expect to be this conflicted. I didn't expect to care. Her admission hit him like a tidal wave. For the first time, Eleanor was being completely open with him, and it made everything feel so much more complicated. Was this the moment everything would change? Was this where the line between business and love would finally blur? Mark took a deep breath. Then what do we do now? Eleanor paused, her gaze steady as she looked into his eyes. I don't have the answers, but maybe we don't need to have it all figured out. Maybe we can take this one day at a time and see where it leads. For a moment, there was a new understanding between them. It wasn't just about the contract anymore. It wasn't just about securing their futures. This, whatever it was more than that. Mark didn't know where this path would take them, but for the first time in their arrangement, he felt something real. It was small, but it was there. And that, he realized, was more than he had ever expected. As the evening wound down and they left the gala, Mark couldn't help but look at Eleanor in a new light. She wasn't just the powerful, detached businesswoman he had married for financial security. She was someone who, like him, was learning to navigate this strange new world they had created together. And for the first time, he wondered if it was possible for them to rewrite their own story. A story that wasn't bound by contracts or expectations, but by something deeper. As they stepped into the car, the soft hum of the engine filled the silence between them. Mark glanced at Eleanor, unsure of what to say next. But he didn't need to say anything. The change between them was unspoken, felt in the way their hands brushed together as they sat in the back seat. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And for the first time, it felt like the right kind of beginning. The following days were quieter. But something had changed between Mark and Eleanor. There was a subtle shift, like a new layer of trust building between them, though neither of them spoke about it directly. They still maintained the appearance of a perfect couple, attending social events, taking photos together, and navigating the world they had created. But now, there was a tension in the air, one that wasn't there before. A quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that what had started as a business arrangement might be turning into something more. Mark found himself thinking about Eleanor more than he had before, wondering if she was feeling the same pull that he was. Their interactions had shifted. They were still professional, but at times, there was an undeniable warmth. Eleanor's smile, though rare, felt more genuine now. Her hand, once distant, now brushed against his without hesitation when they stood side by side. It was as if they were both quietly testing the waters, afraid to admit the growing connection that was forming. One evening, after an exhausting day of meetings and gala events, they returned to the mansion, and Eleanor, unusually tired, collapsed onto the couch in the living room. Mark stood by the door for a moment, unsure whether he should leave her alone or join her. Finally, he walked over, sitting carefully on the armchair across from her. There was a moment of silence between them. Eleanor was staring at the fireplace, her expression unreadable. Mark, Eleanor said softly, her voice a little strained. Do you ever wonder what this could be if we stopped pretending? She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the flames. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Was she really asking what he thought she was? Was she ready to acknowledge that there was something more to their arrangement? I've been wondering that a lot, Mark replied quietly, his voice low, careful not to break the fragile moment between them. I mean, we started this as a contract, but it doesn't feel like that anymore. Not with you. Her eyes flickered toward him then, her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but the words seemed to get stuck. Instead, she sighed, a soft exhale that spoke volumes about the conflict within her. I know, she whispered. I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to care. Mark moved a little closer, feeling the weight of her words. There. It was again, something real. It was there, hanging in the air between them, making the room feel warmer despite the cool night outside. Eleanor, he said, his voice soft but earnest. I don't know what this is, but I don't want to pretend anymore either. I don't want to just be in this for the contract. I want to know if there's something more here. She looked at him fully then, her eyes meeting his with an intensity he had never seen before. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic confessions. It was just the quiet, heavy understanding that they were both on the same page now, both grappling with the realization that their arrangement was changing. "I think," Eleanor said finally, "we have a choice. We can keep going this way, just maintaining the image. Or we can be honest with ourselves and see where this takes us." Mark nodded slowly, his heart beating faster. "So what do you want, Eleanor? What do we do now?" Eleanor smiled, the first real smile he had seen in a long time. It was soft, unguarded, and Mark found himself smiling back without thinking. "I think," she said, "we take a step forward. We stop pretending that everything's just a deal. We see if we can build something real. Together." Mark's breath caught in his throat. Had she really just said that? Was this the moment when everything finally changed? He reached out instinctively, his hand brushing against hers. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a promise. Eleanor squeezed his hand lightly, her smile widening just a fraction. "I don't know what's going to happen," she continued, her voice soft. "But I'm willing to try if you are." Mark's heart swelled. He had no idea where this would lead, what kind of future he could build with her. But at that moment, for the first time, it felt possible. It felt like something worth fighting for. "I'm in," he said simply. "Let's see where this takes us." As the night stretched on, they sat together, not saying much more. But the quiet was different now. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. For the first time since this all began, Mark felt like he was in the right place. Not because of the wealth or the status, but because of what they had just shared, a decision to move forward, together, no longer bound by the terms of a contract, but by the hope of something more. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor continued to navigate their relationship, no longer hiding behind the pretense of a business deal. They didn't rush into anything, but they allowed themselves the space to grow closer. The walls they had built around themselves began to come down slowly, and with each passing day, Mark felt a little more like he was home. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Mark felt ready to take it with Eleanor. The contract was no longer just a contract. It had become the foundation for something deeper, something that neither of them had expected. But as they faced the future together, Mark knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking this path alone. Mark and Eleanor's relationship began to shift in ways neither of them had expected. What had started as a business arrangement, a mere contract for convenience, was slowly growing into something more complicated. They had both let down their guards, the carefully constructed walls between them starting to crumble. The change wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Mark found himself thinking about Eleanor more than ever before. When they were apart, he missed the quiet moments they shared, the ease of their conversations that had once been strained, now filled with laughter and genuine connection. Eleanor, too, began to notice the difference. She had never anticipated that she could find someone who could make her laugh, who could challenge her in ways that went beyond business strategy. Her world, once so meticulously organized, now felt a little more unpredictable. And for the first time in years, she found herself looking forward to the future with Mark, uncertain of what it would bring, but curious nonetheless. One evening, after a particularly long day filled with back-to-back meetings, they found themselves alone in the living room of their estate, the soft glow of the firelight casting shadows on the walls. Mark had been quiet for most of the night, lost in his thoughts. Eleanor, sensing his distance, asked, "What's on your mind?" Mark hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to voice the thoughts swirling in his head. He had always been careful with his words, but this time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. "I've been thinking about us," he said finally. "How far we've come since the day we signed that contract." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her expression softening as she sat down beside him. "And what do you think?" she asked, her voice gentle. Mark turned to face her, meeting her eyes for the first time that evening. I think I was wrong to believe this could just be a business deal. It's become so much more. I didn't expect to feel the way I do about you." There was a pause as Eleanor absorbed his words. She had always prided herself on being in control, on never letting anything, especially emotions, throw her off balance. But now, as she sat beside Mark, she found herself wondering if maybe she had underestimated the potential of their relationship. She had never planned for this to be anything more than a strategic partnership. But with Mark, things were different. He made her feel seen, in a way that no one else had in years. I never expected this either, Eleanor said quietly. I've been so focused on control, on making sure everything is perfect, that I never really allowed myself to feel anything beyond the surface. But with you, it's different. She paused, her fingers nervously toying with the edge of her sleeve. I don't know where this is going, Mark. But I do know that I'm not ready to walk away from it. Not now. Mark reached out, his hand brushing against hers, a simple gesture, but one that held more meaning than either of them had anticipated. Then let's stop pretending, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Let's stop living like this is just a contract, and see where it really takes us. Because I don't want to go back to what it was before. Eleanor looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no turning back now. They were both in this, together, whether they fully understood what that meant or not. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. I agree, she said, her voice soft but resolute. I don't want to go back either. For a while, they sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. It wasn't awkward, though. It was comfortable, as if they had finally reached a place where they could be honest with each other. Mark leaned back in his chair, still holding Eleanor's hand, and smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The next few weeks brought more change. They still attended the necessary events, still had to navigate the world of business, but now there was something else in the mix, something personal, something real. They were no longer just playing a part. They were building something, even if neither of them fully understood what it would look like in the end. For the first time, Mark began to feel like he had a future, one that didn't just depend on the money or the status, but on something deeper. But as the days passed, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They had crossed a line, and with that came new challenges. The pressure to maintain the facade of the perfect couple weighed heavily on both of them, especially as they found themselves more and more invested in each other. What would people say? What would their friends, colleagues, and family think? They hadn't talked about it much, but the tension was there, simmering just below the surface. One evening, as they prepared for yet another gala, Eleanor turned to Mark, her expression serious. Do you think we're ready for this? She asked, her voice low. For everyone to know that this isn't just a business arrangement anymore? That we're something more. Mark looked at her, the uncertainty in her eyes mirroring his own. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it with her by his side. I don't know what tomorrow looks like, he said, but I know that right now, this is real, and I want to see where it goes. Eleanor smiled, a rare, soft smile that reached her eyes. Then let's take it one step at a time. And for the first time, neither of them felt the need to rush. They would take it slow, let the pieces fall where they may. And together, they would find out what this was really about. It had been a few weeks since Mark and Eleanor decided to stop pretending. They had been taking it slow, letting the changes between them happen naturally, without forcing anything. There were still moments of doubt, moments when they both questioned whether they were making the right decision. But as time passed, those moments grew fewer and farther apart. The trust that had begun to form between them was growing stronger. They weren't just business partners anymore. They were becoming something more, something neither of them had expected when they first signed the contract. The balance between their public lives and their personal lives was delicate, but for the first time, it felt like they could navigate it together. One evening, Mark was sitting in the living room, waiting for Eleanor to return from a meeting. It had been a long day for both of them, filled with calls and meetings that had kept them apart most of the afternoon. He was looking forward to the quiet evening they had planned, just the two of them, no events, no distractions. As he glanced at the clock, he noticed it was getting late. Eleanor should have been back by now. Just as he was about to text her, the front door opened, and Eleanor stepped inside. Her usual composure was slightly off. Her jacket was askew, and her expression was distant, like she had something on her mind. Mark stood up immediately, concerned. Hey, are you okay? He asked, walking toward her. Eleanor paused, her gaze flickering to him before she forced a smile. I'm fine, she said, but her voice lacked the usual warmth. Mark could tell something was bothering her. He didn't need to ask again. He could feel it. You don't have to pretend, he said softly, reaching for her hand. What happened? Eleanor hesitated, then let out a sigh, sitting down on the couch. She leaned back, her hands folded in her lap. "It's nothing," she started, but Mark knew better. He sat beside her, waiting for her to continue. "It's just, there's a lot happening right now. Business stuff, personal stuff. Things are moving so fast. I don't know if I'm ready for it all." Mark listened closely, his hand still resting gently on hers. He could hear the frustration in her voice, the uncertainty that had crept in despite her usual strong demeanor. "You don't have to do it all alone," he said quietly. "I'm here. We're in this together." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes softening for a moment. "I know," she whispered. "But sometimes, I feel like I'm losing control of everything. Like I'm not sure what's real anymore, and what's just part of the deal we made." Mark squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Eleanor, we don't have to rush. We don't have to have everything figured out right now. Whatever happens, I'm with you. And if this," he motioned between the two of them, "is real, then we can take it one step at a time." Eleanor paused, looking down at their intertwined hands. There was a long silence between them, one that was filled with both fear and hope. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shook his head gently. "I don't think we're like everyone else. And I don't think we're forcing anything. I think we're finally letting it be what it's meant to be. But we can't be afraid of that." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face as if looking for reassurance. For the first time, there was no mask, no perfect exterior, just two people trying to make sense of what was happening between them. Slowly, Eleanor leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a soft, tentative kiss. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt like everything. It was an unspoken promise, a promise that they weren't ready to let go of each other. As they pulled away, Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her eyes. "Maybe we don't have all the answers," she said, "but I think we're starting to figure it out." Mark smiled back, feeling something in his chest loosen. "I think we are," he agreed. That night, as they sat in the quiet of their home, the weight of the world outside seemed to fade away. They didn't have to be perfect, and they didn't have to have everything figured out. All they needed was to take it one day at a time, together. And for the first time, Mark felt a peace settle over him. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And with Eleanor by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, Mark felt like he was on the right path. And maybe, just maybe, Eleanor felt the same way. Weeks passed, and with each day, Mark and Eleanor grew closer. The line between business and personal continued to blur, but neither of them was scared anymore. They had found a rhythm, a balance that worked for them, despite the pressures of their public image and the expectations placed on them by their world. But, as they both knew, everything had its breaking point. Eleanor had spent her entire life controlling every aspect of her world. The business, the estate, her image, everything had to be perfect. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if perfection was enough. It all started when the company faced an unexpected financial crisis. The stakes were high, and the pressure mounted on Eleanor. She spent hours in meetings, trying to resolve the issues, and the strain started to show. Mark noticed it first in her late-night phone calls, in the way her eyes would gloss over when she stared at the spreadsheets, the tightness in her shoulders when she walked into the room. It wasn't just the business. He could see that it was taking a toll on her, emotionally. One evening, after yet another long day of meetings, Eleanor came home, looking exhausted. She walked into the living room, slumping into the couch. Mark was already there, waiting for her, his expression full of concern. "You've been at it all day, haven't you?" he asked softly, sitting beside her. Eleanor didn't answer at first. She just stared ahead, her mind clearly somewhere else. "Eleanor." Mark's voice was gentle, but persistent. She finally turned to face him, her eyes tired and filled with frustration. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Mark," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm losing control. Everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it. I thought I could handle everything. But now I feel like I'm just treading water." Mark reached for her hand, holding it gently in his. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly. "You never have to do this alone." He paused, giving her time to process his words. "I'm here, Eleanor. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." For a moment, Eleanor just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, she let out a long, shaky breath, her shoulders slumping in exhaustion. I'm so scared, she whispered. What if I lose everything? What if I'm not enough to keep it all together? Mark squeezed her hand tighter, his voice steady. You are enough. You've always been enough. And even if things don't go perfectly, I'm right here. You don't have to carry this weight alone. She looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time in days. The walls that had always kept her emotions in check started to crack, and Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to control everything. Mark was here, and together, they could handle whatever life threw their way. I don't know what the future holds, Eleanor said quietly, her voice more vulnerable than Mark had ever heard it. But I know that whatever happens, I don't want to face it without you. Mark smiled, his heart full. You won't have to. I'm not going anywhere. And in that moment, everything changed. The fear that had been holding Eleanor back, the fear of losing control, began to fade. She realized that no matter how hard things got, as long as they had each other, they could face it. The business, the image, the expectations, they didn't matter as much anymore. What mattered was the connection they shared, the partnership they had built. It was real, and it was theirs. As the days went on, Eleanor leaned more on Mark, trusting him more with the weight of her world. They made decisions together, worked through the tough moments, and celebrated the small victories. It wasn't easy, and there were still challenges to face, but they knew now that they could handle them. Together. It was clear now, this was no longer just a contract. It had turned into something neither of them could have predicted, something stronger than either of them had imagined. It was a partnership built on trust, on vulnerability, and on love. And though they didn't have all the answers, Mark and Eleanor knew that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. As the months passed, Mark and Eleanor's connection deepened. What had begun as an arrangement, one born out of necessity and circumstance, had transformed into something neither of them could have anticipated. They had found a rhythm, a balance between their personal lives and the ever-present demands of their public personas. Together, they navigated the complexities of both the business world and their growing feelings for each other, learning to trust one another more with each passing day. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of their responsibilities threatened to pull them apart. The company continued to face challenges, and Eleanor's role in it demanded more of her time and attention. But Mark was always there, supporting her, reassuring her, just as she had done for him in the early days of their arrangement. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Eleanor found herself standing in front of the window of their living room, looking out at the city lights. She had just finished a series of back-to-back meetings, and the exhaustion from it all weighed heavily on her. But as she gazed out at the skyline, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She was no longer carrying the weight of the world alone. Mark was with her, and together, they had built something real. Mark entered the room quietly, noticing the quiet reflection on Eleanor's face. He walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. You okay? He asked softly. Eleanor smiled faintly, turning to face him. Yeah, I'm just thinking about everything. Mark raised an eyebrow, his concern evident. What about everything? She took a deep breath, her gaze meeting his. I never imagined this. I never imagined that something so unexpected could turn into something so important, so real. She paused, her voice softening. You've changed everything for me, Mark, in ways I didn't know were possible. Mark's heart swelled as he looked at her. He had always admired Eleanor's strength and independence, but hearing her say this, hearing the vulnerability in her voice, made everything they had been through together feel worth it. I feel the same way, he replied, his voice steady and filled with sincerity. I never expected this either, but now that it's here, I don't want to let it go. For a moment, they just stood there, a quiet understanding passing between them. They had both been afraid to open up, afraid to let someone else in, but now they knew that they had something worth holding on to. As the evening wore on, they sat together in the living room, talking about their future. They didn't have all the answers, but they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The business, the estate, the expectations, it didn't matter as much anymore. What mattered was the partnership they had built, the love that had grown out of a contract, and the life they were creating side by side. Weeks later, as they stood together in front of their friends and family, the final piece of their journey together fell into place. Mark and Eleanor exchanged vows, not out of obligation, but out of a deep, genuine love for each other. The contract that had once bound them was no longer a symbol of necessity, but a reminder of how far they had come. "I never thought this would be my life," Eleanor said softly during their ceremony. "But I'm so glad it is." Mark smiled, taking her hand. "Me too," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And I wouldn't want to share it with anyone else." In that moment, surrounded by the people who had supported them, Mark and Eleanor knew that they had found something rare, something real. Their journey had begun with a business deal, but it had evolved into a love story, one that neither of them could have predicted but both of them cherished. The future was still uncertain, but they knew they would face it, whatever it held, together. And as the night drew to a close, Mark and Eleanor shared a quiet moment, side by side, knowing that the most important part of their story had only just begun.